After losing my beloved husband, my mother supported me and my son. But then she fell gravely ill and passed away, leaving an inheritance of $3 million. My husband James, who my mother had encouraged me to remarry, had been crying at the funeral until a moment ago. Suddenly he smirked and said,
"Yes, $3 million.
It seemed he had a plan to take the inheritance for himself. He started making contracts for houses and cars, feeling confident. But a month later, he panicked when he checked the bank account.
Where's the $3 million?
What are you talking about? I had outsmarted his plan with the help of an unexpected person. My name is Emily Osborne, a 45-year-old full-time housewife. My husband, James, is 38, 7 years younger than me. He's actually my second husband. I first got married at the age of 27 to my high school classmate, Henry. But Henry passed away 10 years ago. Our marriage lasted only 8 short years. I had imagined walking through life together until we grew old, but illness took my beloved husband to heaven. With no time to mourn, I raised our son Kyle as a single parent. 4 years ago, during Henry's 7th memorial, I received an unexpected proposal from Henry's father, Mr. Kent.
Emily, you should move on. You've done so much, but it's time to live freely. You're still young. Please, think about finding happiness and enjoying your life again.
Mr. Kent had always looked after me and Kyle, even after Henry passed away. He bought Kyle's school supplies and attended his entrance ceremony as a father would. Since we lived nearby, he helped with childcare and took care of me when I was unwell. Mr. Kent, who had raised Henry alone after losing his wife when Henry was in middle school, understood my struggles.
I don't mean to cut ties with you or Kyle, but I thought if you remained legally bound to us, it might be hard for you to move on. I'm suggesting you file a termination of kinship.
I had never submitted a termination of kinship after Henry passed away. Mr. Kent, being a lawyer, knew this process well and was thinking about my future. The termination of kinship would end the legal family ties established through marriage. When you marry, you form kinship ties with your spouse's parents, siblings, and grandparents. When a spouse dies, those ties remain unless you formally terminate them. Of course, the bond between Kyle and his grandfather wouldn't be affected since they are related by blood.
Don't worry, Emily. I'll handle all the legal paperwork to make sure everything goes smoothly, including inheritance matters.
Henry's kindness must have come from his father. Mr. Kent, I want you to stay close to Kyle and me. I'm not expecting anything from the inheritance, but please continue to be a part of our lives. Mr. Kent teared up at my words. Even though he had wanted to give me the freedom to move on, I knew he didn't want to lose our connection.
Thank you, Emily. If you ever change your mind, don't hesitate to tell me. I'll continue to support you and Kyle.
Mr. Kent, still youthful in his late 60s, was a reliable and comforting presence. I was also reluctant to cut ties with him. Even 6 years after Henry's death, I still loved him. I couldn't imagine letting go of his last name. That's why I didn't submit the termination of kinship at the time. But 2.5 years later, everything changed when my mother was hospitalized. I received a call that she had collapsed at a supermarket. My heart nearly stopped when I heard the news. It was a weekday morning. I was at work when the paramedics called and I rushed to the hospital alone. Kyle was at school at the time. When I arrived at the hospital, a male nurse, James Osborne, approached me.
Are you Mrs. Clare's family? She's stable now, so there's no need to worry. I'll explain more once we get to her room.
James's calm expression and gentle smile helped me regain my composure. He explained that my mother had collapsed from anemia while shopping, and a store clerk had called an ambulance. I regretted not forcing her to go to the hospital sooner. She had complained about fatigue and shortness of breath recently, but she dismissed it, saying it was just normal for her age. Still, I should have insisted. Thankfully, she had collapsed in public where she was found quickly. If she had been alone at home, things could have been much worse. After her discharge, I resolved to bring her home with me. At the time, I thought her collapse was nothing serious, but the doctor's next words shattered my hopes.
We need to conduct more tests, but her blood results suggest she might have leukemia.
At first, I didn't understand what he was saying. Leukemia? Isn't that a disease for young people? I had only seen it in dramas and movies. I couldn't believe it was happening to my 70-year-old mother. The doctor explained that they would need to perform a bone marrow test. He explained the procedure, but it still didn't feel real to me.
Doctor, perhaps it's best if we explain more at a later time when she's had a chance to process everything. Yes, you're right. We'll explain the treatment options after we confirm the diagnosis.
I couldn't wrap my head around what was happening. Why was this happening to me again? I had lost my husband so young, and now my mother had this terrible illness. God was being cruel, testing the people I loved most.
It's normal to feel overwhelmed in these situations. If you ever need to talk, we're here for you.
James's kind words helped calm me down.
I accidentally called you by your maiden name earlier. I'm sorry about that. I'm not a very good nurse, huh?
I noticed he had glanced at the wedding ring on my left hand. Even after Henry passed, I had never taken it off. I smiled and said, No, you're a wonderful nurse. It's natural you called me by my mother's name. North is my late husband's surname.
I apologize again for the mistake.
Seeing James flustered like that made me laugh, even in such a difficult moment. I was surprised I could still laugh. Don't worry about it, I said. It's been more than 8 years since my husband passed.
Still, losing someone important to you never goes away, no matter how much time passes.
James's thoughtful words made me realize what a kind person he truly was. I was grateful that he would be my mother's nurse. Thanks to James, I slowly started regaining my composure. I had to stay strong. Kyle was now in his second year of middle school, and though he could handle some household chores, I wanted him to enjoy his school life. But with my work, hospital visits, and everything going on, I would be home less often. Kyle might need to help more than before. When I told Kyle about my mother's hospitalization, he responded with strong, reassuring words. Mom, don't worry about doing it all on your own. I'll help with whatever I can. You can't get sick too. I realized then that Kyle was no longer the small boy I needed to protect, but a dependable partner. God might have been harsh to me, but he had also given me a wonderful son, and for that, I was thankful. And so began my mother's hospital life. After a bone marrow test, she was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia. When my doctor told me, my vision went dark again. But I remembered a conversation I once had with my mother when we were watching a drama about terminal illness. She said that if she were in that situation, she would want to be told the truth. So I decided to tell her everything and let her decide how to fight the illness.
For patients over 70, bone marrow transplants are usually not an option. Strong chemotherapy is also difficult, so full recovery is unlikely.
I explained everything to my mother, and despite the bad news, she remained remarkably calm.
I've lived over 70 years, and I've had a wonderful life. I don't need to cling to it anymore. Your father is waiting for me in heaven.
Mom, don't say that. I knew what she was feeling, but as her daughter, I couldn't give up so easily. If you refuse treatment, how long do you have? The word prognosis made me tremble as I asked.
Maybe a few months. I see. That might not be enough time for you and Kyle to prepare yourselves. Maybe I'll accept some treatment just to buy a little more time, but I don't want to spend the rest of my life stuck in the hospital.
My mother made her decision clear. Even in such a dire situation, she was thinking of us first. She opted for light chemotherapy, but refused to aim for a full recovery. The hospital had a specialized team, so she could receive the necessary treatment there. James continued to be her nurse, which gave me great comfort.
Emily, you're so busy. You don't need to visit me every day. I can rent my clothes from the hospital service, so you don't need to bring me anything.
No, Mom. I want to come and see you every day. My mother tried to make things easier for me, but when Kyle visited, her face lit up. After enduring chemotherapy, my mother was eventually allowed to go home for a while. She wanted to spend as much time as possible at home. But before her discharge, while I was packing up her things, James peeked into the room and handed me a note.
It's against hospital rules for nurses to share personal contact information with patients' families, but I want you to have this in case you ever need to talk.
His whispered words made my heart race.
If it's not a bother, I'd love to stay in touch and help however I can.
His sincerity caught me off guard. Thank you. I like to keep in touch. You've been such a great help, and I'd love to show my gratitude.
I'm sorry, this is so inappropriate of me, especially while your mother's sick, but feel free to reach out whenever.
James's words gave me a little hope, but I quickly reminded myself not to get carried away. What was I thinking? I'm a 43-year-old woman. There's no way someone 7 years younger than me would be interested. But it turned out that James really did care for me. After my mother was discharged, James would visit often, even on his days off. He would spend time with my mother, and she was always happy to see him.
James, every time I see you, I feel better. If I had a son like you, I'd be so happy.
I think my mother could sense that I am beginning to have feelings for James.
If Emily ever gives you a chance, don't hesitate. If Mrs. Clare is giving me a push, maybe I'll gather the courage to ask her out.
His teasing smile made my heart skip a beat. Could he really be interested in me?
I'm not going to be around much longer, but I worry about Emily and Kyle. I hope they find someone dependable and kind to take care of them.
Mom, stop. You're embarrassing me.
It's not embarrassing at all. I'd be honored if I could be the one to support you and Kyle.
James's sudden confession left me speechless. Could this really be happening? I had never forgotten Henry, but I had started to fall for James. It had only been 6 months, but I decided to take the leap and give this relationship a chance.
You don't have to forget about Henry. I'll love you and accept the part of you always. Please, marry me.
James's pure heart moved me to tears. I said yes. It didn't matter what others thought or how soon it was. I didn't want to let this chance slip by. When I told my mother and Kyle about the proposal, they both wholeheartedly supported us. With my mother's illness and everything going on, my wedding would be small, but Mr. Kent was also supportive.
Emily, I'm so happy for you. There's no better news than your remarriage. We can't celebrate too much with Mrs. Clare's health, but I'm rooting for you.
Mr. Kent even helped guide me through the process of submitting the termination of kinship. Everything seemed to be falling into place, but then tragedy struck again. Shortly after our marriage, my mother passed away. Even though I had been prepared, it still hurt more than I could bear. Kyle and I were heartbroken, crying endlessly during the funeral preparations. My husband James had also been mourning, until suddenly his demeanor changed.
Yes, $3 million.
Kyle, confused, asked him, "What are you talking about?"
Didn't you know? Your grandma left behind a $3 million inheritance.
I couldn't believe what I was hearing. James, who had once been so kind, was now more concerned with the inheritance than grieving for my mother. How do you know about that? James only smiled smugly and refused to answer directly. The truth was that my mother did leave behind a fortune, but James couldn't inherit it legally.
Since you're not a legal heir, you can't inherit the money, James. That's not true. She promised she would change her will for me. Are you sure about that?
Mr. Kent had a plan to teach James a lesson.
Give me a month and I'll explain everything.
Over the next month, James's true nature emerged. He quit his job and began spending money on extravagant things, all in anticipation of the inheritance. When the month was up, James angrily called Mr. Kent. Mr. Kent had come over to explain the situation to James.
Where's my money? Calm down, James. The inheritance you think you're entitled to doesn't exist the way you think it does. What are you talking about? I saw the will. It's mine. What you saw was a fake will. It was prepared to expose your true intentions. The real will is legally sound and follows all proper procedures. Emily's mother never changed her will for you.
You thought you could take advantage of my mother's illness and trick her into changing the will? Ugh, you disgust me.
No, that's not true. She promised me everything. James, you have no legal claim to anything. The inheritance is strictly going to Emily and Kyle.
And to think you were just pretending to care about us all along? Waiting for her to die?
That's not it. I cared about you, but I also deserved something for taking care of her.
Taking care of her? You did nothing. You were just waiting for your payday. You're no longer welcome here, James. You've been lying to me since the beginning. I can't believe I let you into my life.
You can't do this. I deserve that money. It's not fair.
It's over, James. Get out of this house and never come back.
You'll regret this. You're making a huge mistake. Leave now, James, before I call the police.
I never want to see you again. Get out of our lives for good. James stormed out of the house, fuming, but there was nothing he could do. He had lost everything. Later, we found out that James couldn't keep up with the payments on the house and car he had recklessly signed for. He ended up in debt, and his reputation in the medical field was tarnished. Mr. Kent and I filed for divorce, and I was awarded damages for the emotional distress James had caused. I'm just glad we can move on now, I said to Mr. Kent one evening.
You and Kyle deserve happiness, Emily. James was never worthy of you.
We're better off without him, Mom. I knew something was off about him from the start. I looked at Kyle, amazed by how much he had grown. You're right, Kyle. We're going to be just fine. With Mr. Kent by our side and our family growing stronger, I felt ready to face the future.